Well, good morning. Welcome to Sunday morning Bible study. I hope that you've had a good week and you're continuing to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. Last week we had a resurrection Sunday school lesson. We looked at Matthew 28. Prior to that, as you know, we've been looking at the book of Daniel. We've been following the Baptist Way Press materials. And the title of that lesson, as you saw on the first screen, was Faith Under Fire. What we're going to be doing this week is picking up where we left off last time. We looked at Daniel chapter 5 last time. You remember that's when Daniel saw the writing on the wall, was able to interpret that for the king. And what he was able to do then is he was able to relate to the king what had happened or what would happen, and it happened immediately. The chapter ends with a reference to the fact that when Belshazzar died, Darius the Mede succeeded him at the age of 62. At the beginning of chapter 6, as we're going to see, picks up where we left off, but you can see on the screen that we're going to be looking at chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, living in the lion's den. So if you have your Bibles, you want to get those out. We're going to be reading chapter 6, verses 1 to 28. And as we do, I just want to pick up on a couple of things that we're going to be looking at. One of the things I'd like for you to see is just a quick read and introduction to the text. What you know, and you've seen this with Daniel before, he's going to demonstrate his faithfulness, just like he has done before, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have. We're coming into this last narrative chapter in the book. And so you can see the introduction on the screen. In the book's final chapter of narrative, Daniel demonstrated the potential of a godly, uncompromising life in the face of adversity. As a result, God received the glory from the life and work of this faithful and humble servant. As you read over and over again the book of Daniel, you read chapter to chapter, you are going to see that faithfulness exhibited. That's been one of the leading themes, overarching themes that we've talked about. We've talked about God being in control. We've talked about the faithfulness of these individuals, representative of those that remain true to Yahweh. And also we represented the fact, or identified the fact, that one function of the book of Daniel is to be an example of what Israel was called to be from the very beginning, and that is to influence other people groups for serving Yahweh. As we look at the text, then, we're going to see that Daniel 6 can be divided into 4 scenes. You could probably divide it up even more than that with all the changes going back and forth between the different segments. But these are 4 big units that we can look at. Scene 1 is going to be chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. And you'll see there the decree targeting Daniel. We'll talk a little bit about that and what that decree was that you're familiar with. It's a very, very familiar story. The people are going to come after Daniel for all kinds of reasons that really aren't mentioned in the text, but we can surmise. Scene 2 is a short section, but it's the meat of the text. This is Daniel remaining faithful and praying only to God. We'll see what the target on Daniel's back was and why the people, or what they were looking for to come after Daniel. Scene 3, Darius. Some will say Darius. I spent a long time saying Darius. Then I went to college and seminary, and everyone says Darius, so I've learned to say Darius. Darius, either way. What happens is, as the king, as the leader, he carries out the decree when he finds out that Daniel is not keeping the law that's been put in place. So Darius puts Daniel in the lion's den, and we'll see that in verses 14 to 23. And then the last scene will be Darius's new decree about Daniel's God, and that will be the final verses. And what you'll see when you look at that is you're going to see not only a decree, but a letter that is sent out to all people groups, according to the text, similar to what you saw with Nebuchadnezzar a few chapters before. But in this sense, it even goes deeper than that. We'll see to what extent Darius extends this glory to God. Well, as we move through the text, then, I want you to think about a couple of things. A quick question. How old do you think Daniel is in this context? Take a moment to think about that. You've been reading through the book of Daniel, and we've only read 6 chapters, or we're coming into the 6th chapter, and we all have an image in our mind of what Daniel looked like. Do you think of him as a young man? Because I know that most of the time when I think of Daniel as a young man, or when I read the book of Daniel, I think of him as a young man throughout. And I think we tend to do that because we read the first 5 chapters, we get into the 6th chapter, and time just seems to go really, really fast. But what you need to know is that time has changed. We're not the only ones, though, that think about Daniel being a young man. Take a look at this picture that was drawn or painted by Peter Paul Rubens back in the early 1600s. This is a painting that's now in the National Gallery of Art entitled Daniel in the Lion's Den. Notice first you can see the lions around him. You can see the hole peeking up into the sky. And then you see Daniel there, fairly young. Certainly he's not a boy anymore, but he's still a young man. But is that really how old he was? Really, what you need to recognize is that a lot of time has passed since the beginning of the book. Remember that in 605 BC, it was the 3rd year of the reign of King Joachim of Judah when Nebuchadnezzar came in and sacked the city, took out exiles. He did take some of the things from the temple, some of those nice vessels and so forth. Those are the same vessels that were used later by Belshazzar in chapter 5 when he threw a party and then saw the writing on the wall. What we're reading about this week is Darius, and then Cyrus is going to be mentioned. What we need to know is that Daniel goes among the exiles in 605, and then Cyrus defeats the Babylonians in 539. So if Daniel is there during the time of King Nebuchadnezzar in 605, and he's still there in 539 when Cyrus comes along, do the math. 605 minus 539 is 66 years. Now, we have been reading Daniel for a few weeks, but when you read chapters 1 through 6, you only think a little bit of time has passed, but we need to pay attention to what I like to call those timestamps. We've seen at now the 3rd king, whatever role Darius plays in this, whatever his title is, but we will see a 4th king with Cyrus coming up. We often don't think about this as we read the text, but in reality, Daniel is probably in his late 70s, possibly early 80s at this time, having served 66 years among the Babylonians and now the Medes. It's another picture that comes along by Thomas Agnew and Sons of 1892. You can see another version of a lion's den. You can see an older looking Daniel here. This is a picture portraying Daniel looking up when Darius comes and opens up the entrance to ask if he's okay. But you can see here that you have an older looking man. So I want you to think about that. Oftentimes we don't think about how much time has passed. We always think of Moses as an old person. We tend to think of Daniel as a young person. Well, let's go ahead and spend some time then looking at our lesson. What I'd like to do is go through the text a little bit by a little bit, maybe read whole portions of this just so that you get an understanding of it. And then I'm going to raise some questions and give some insights here and there. Again, note that this is the last narrative chapter in the book. What we're going to see moving forward are depictions of Daniel in his memoir, so to speak, where he will report the visions that he's had, the challenges he's had interpreting them, and then getting interpretation from someone else later. There are references to the other kings that have preceded. So we see in these visions, some of these visions occurred about the same time he was interpreting the other dreams. So we just recognize that we go into a different form of literature altogether when we get into those next chapters. And I have to admit, having already looked ahead, done a lot of study and looked at Daniel over the years, there's a lot that I'm sure of and there's a lot that I'm not so sure of. And so what we're going to be looking at is struggling with the meaning of these visions and then looking at the big picture and what is the main application for us moving forward. As we look at the text, let me just read a couple of the verses to start us and then come back and deal with a rather challenging historical question. Chapter 6, verse 1 opens up, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, of whom David was one. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss." So what you see here is Darius setting up a system of leadership throughout the kingdom that has been established, and whether they're local mayors, however you want to regard them, there's an upline to them. And what Darius has then done is he's got 3 main administrators. So that evens out to about 40 people assigned to these administrators. And then note the language here that you have one of these administrators is Daniel. And so probably at minimum, he's got 40 under him. We're going to see other layers of administration mentioned in a couple of verses, and that means there's more and more people under him. Here's the question that comes to bear when you read this text. Darius, as scholars recognize, at least a Darius that's given during this time period preceding Cyrus, is nowhere mentioned outside the Bible. Now, there's a Darius I who comes after Cyrus, but not one that comes before. So there's a question, what's going on here? We don't want to hide from these texts. We don't want to hide from these challenges. I'll just say up front that as you think about it, for me, the Bible has been proven true over and over again. And so while there have been questions in the past, many of them have been answered, either by documents discovered, archaeological finds, whatnot. Just because we have a gap in knowledge here doesn't mean the Bible's wrong. What I think is going to happen is we're going to see either there's a wrong reading of the text, or that we'll find that, just like we did in the book of Luke, finding Quirinius and so forth, there will be some affirmations there. But there have been attempts to try and figure out who Darius is, and you can see as if you've read the text, if you have a study Bible, or if you've looked at some other study materials, there are different ways to try and figure out who he is. One suggestion is that this is Darius the first, but what the writer did was flipped Darius and Cyrus. Most of this comes from those who would believe that Daniel was written many, many centuries after this was actually occurred, or actually was portrayed. That would put Daniel about the 200s. There are other reasons why some people are going to look at Daniel as being written in the 200s, particularly with what we're going to see in the visions later. But one option is to consider that. The challenge with that, of course, is the fact that when you look at the text itself, it says it was Darius, then Cyrus. It's kind of hard to get those mixed up. Another suggestion is that Darius is Cyrus, and that when you get to the end of chapter 6, when it says that he reigned and was successful under Darius and Cyrus, one way to read that text is that he was successful under Darius, who was also Cyrus. Now, why is that a challenge for us? Well, Cyrus was the Persian who defeated the Babylonians, but here you seem to have Darius, a Mede, and we know that eventually, prior to the destruction of Babylon, or the taking of Babylon, you have the Persians defeating the Medes, and then together that group, why they're called the Medes and the Persians, take over Babylon. So what's going on there? Is it possible that Darius and Cyrus are the same person? Another suggestion might be that what you have is that Belshazzar, being a leader in Babylon, is already taken with Medes, and that Darius is one of those Medes. And so while he's called king in the chapter, it's not a reference to the kind of king that you would see among Babylonians or among the Persians, that he was maybe like some of the people that Daniel were among. He was a leader, but was specially chosen by Belshazzar. And so what happened then, when Belshazzar dies, he is the immediate successor to him. So it could be that that was the case, and it could be that at the time he was known by a different name, whether or not Darius is a throne name, much like popes have names and then they're given names. This might be a throne name for Darius, and he might have gone by a different name. It might have been a governor of Babylon. Another possibility is that Cyrus, being the king over everything, appointed the Darius as a king over this area. Think later in the Roman Empire, when you have the Roman Emperor Caesar, but then you have people like Herod called king of a region. Again, there are a lot of different things going on there. I don't think that there's anything that should bother us about the text going forward. If there's a detail about who exactly Darius is, then we'll just take that. But I think in time, we'll see that the Bible is proven true at this point. So it could be any number of those things. It is probably, either he's a subordinate to Belshazzar, who then is a stopgap, if you will. One other thing to note, this is a chapter that's completely about Daniel. We've seen 2 chapters like that. We've seen that with chapter 5. We've seen that with chapter 6. Each time there is, Daniel comes to the rescue of a king. Here, there's a challenge to Daniel's faith. Prior to this, we saw a text where Daniel was not present. You look in Daniel chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being challenged because they wouldn't bow to the statue that was made by Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's nowhere around. Why do I bring that up here? Because here's another chapter with Daniel only, and there's no Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What's going on? Why is Daniel not mentioned earlier? Why are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not mentioned here? I really can't answer the question where Daniel was in chapter 3. He's a leader. Surely all of the leaders and even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in official positions, and yet they didn't bow. Daniel's not mentioned. I think a really reasonable explanation can be made for the absence of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 6 and even chapter 5 and 6. Remember, we said at the beginning that there's been many, many decades that have passed, 6 decades minimum that have passed. And it's possible that even though they all might have been about the same age, that going up in age, maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have passed away. Many, many decades have passed. We don't know that. The text doesn't tell us that. They just drop from the scene. So that's a possibility. Bear in mind, though, that what you're going to see in each of these chapters then is a continuing example of the faithfulness that Daniel is going to exhibit toward God when challenged to think otherwise. So what we see here is the administration set up. Daniel is put in a position of higher up. Notice that each of these has a job that ultimately is to keep the king from suffering loss. He's protecting, they serve the king. Verse 3 comes along, and this gives us further indication of Daniel's service to his foreign leader, and he's going to be rewarded. Verse 3 reads, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So there are really different layers of higher ups here. You have a ruler, you have maybe a king, you have all these administrators. Daniel now is going to be placed in a position as a ruler over the whole kingdom, that now he's not going to be just an administrator equal to those other 2. He's going to be put in a position above them. Notice then what takes place in verse 4. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Notice the phrase "at this." And today we like to talk about people being triggered, whether they're sensitive or what. This triggers them. Now there's someone that's going to be above them. They were all on equal footing, all equally under Darius, but now Darius wants to promote Daniel. It's kind of like when you're in the military, you have different layers and levels of generals, 1, 2, 3, 4-star generals. There's this other layer. We don't know why they don't like Daniel. It could be because of his faith in Yahweh. The text doesn't say. Maybe they didn't like the fact that he was a hard worker and he was being singled out. In your study guide, there are 3 possibilities that are given. It could be that they were just jealous of Daniel. That's a possibility. It could be they were insecure. Sometimes those go hand in hand, by the way. And then thirdly, a possibility is just plain nationalism. They don't like the fact that here's a foreigner. Now, at this point in time, there could be any number of different people from different lands rising up into these different positions. We already saw that in Babylon. They took different people from different places and they tested them and trained them and made them leaders, just like Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But notice the triggering here. At this, then, they looked for a way to charge him. Now, what are they going to do? They've already seen him work hard. They've already seen Daniel succeed and excel in all that he did. So they're going to have a hard time. They're trying to go through all that he's done. They're maybe trying to set him up to make a decision that would lead him to in some way violate the rules, or to show disloyalty, or to show some lack of integrity. But what they find is they're not able to charge anything. They look at his conduct in government, but the fact of the matter is it's his conduct in government that's led to his rise. So they weren't able to do that. Notice the text says that they found no corruption in him. He was trustworthy, not corrupt. There was no negligence in him. So they surmise that the only thing they're going to be able to do is look at him and his relationship with God. It says here, find something to do with the law of his God. Now, what it ends up being, of course, is that whatever extent they may have known this, it's hard to say, but we can look back at the 10 Commandments, and what does one of the 10 Commandments say? You shall have no other gods before me. You're not to worship any other gods. There is just the one God. You go back to, that's in Exodus 20. You can go back to Deuteronomy 6. There is one God. You are only to worship him. So what they can do then is set up a situation where Daniel is going to have to make a choice. And so they do. What are they going to do? Verse 6 then. So the administrators and satraps went as a group, and we need to think about that, as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. Now, that's probably a standard saying, but at the same time, I sense, at least, that there's a little bit of trying to get on his good side. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, speaking to Darius, they say, Your Majesty, whoever prays to anyone else but you will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, Your Majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So Darius put the decree in writing. We can talk a long time about this. There's a lot that I want to say about this. I know that we have limited time, but let me just think about a couple of things with you. It was the administrators and the satraps that put this plan together. But when they come to the king, it says as a group. Now, how literally we want to take that, it could be representative, but the way it's reading, there's a strong contingency here, strong contingent group. Notice that it's the administrators and satraps, but when they speak to the king, they say that we've been talking and we think you need to make a decree. And this has been agreed upon by the administrators, the satraps, the prefects, advisors, and governors. So you see all these different layers of government there. And we believe what you need to do is set up a rule for 30 days. Nothing special about 30 days other than perhaps it's, again, a test. And don't let anyone pray to any god or human being except you for that 30 days. If they do, throw them in the lion's den. A couple things about that. One, where's Daniel? Why doesn't the king ask where Daniel is? I mean, if it's representative of all the administrators and the satraps, Daniel's among that group. He's not there. The other thing is, this is clearly a conspiracy, but even more than that, this shows that if there is a layer of satraps actually involved in this, then we have 40 satraps under Daniel who are committing insubordination, and they're going above their superior to undercut him and get him out of office. So there are a number of layers of conspiracy and just pure corruption going on here. The other thing is, they've done this kind of thing and brought it to the king. I'm always wondering what the king's supposed to be doing. But what we have here is a blatant disregard for any kind of leadership proposal here or any kind of leadership structure. They tell the king, this is what we think you ought to do. The king does it. One, again, he doesn't ask, well, where's Daniel? I mean, Daniel's the one that's been up for promotion. Maybe it's that he is in this position now, and the others are trying to get him out of government. So there are a number of situations there. It is curious that you have an entire universal law being put into place. We'll see a connection here in a moment. An entire universal law being put into place because they want to get one person. So they say, let's put this in writing. We know that once it's in writing, according to the laws in the Medes and Persians, that this cannot be repealed. and the king decides to do it. He's not thinking about Daniel at this point. Who knows why? He's not thinking about what impact this might have on people who do actually worship others. It could be that what's going on here is Darius is not thinking in terms of that kind of loyalty to a different God as opposed to him. He may just think, well, this is just for a short time. Surely they should be able to do this for a short period of time and just pray to me. How he's going to receive the prayer, that's another thing. But what we have here is Darius just going along. He's not thinking about the implications. He's just going along. And before we move on and see what happens with Daniel, let me make a couple of quick comments here. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but I think if you're reading this text and you're familiar at all with other texts about this time period, you're thinking of Esther. One of the things I find interesting here is you have a law being made to apply to everybody, even though they only want one person. You see that in Esther as well. Haman doesn't like Mordecai. Now, I know there's a long-standing hatred of Haman for the Jewish people in general because of what happened during the time of Saul and the Agagites. So he has that, centuries-old, vendetta against him. But he's targeting Mordecai because Mordecai kind of disrespects him. But now he's going to ask the king, Xerxes, to create this all-encompassing law against the Jews because he doesn't like Mordecai. We have the same thing here. You have an all-encompassing law targeting one person. Now, clearly it's not targeting just one person. It ultimately is going to target any Jews or other people. But their focus is only on Daniel. Notice then there are other options. You can see other parallels. There are a number of other parallels. One other one I'll bring up later, or bring up now, that happens later in the text, and that is the fact that eventually these individuals that set this trap for Daniel end up suffering the fate that they set for Daniel, just like Haman, in setting the gallows for Mordecai, ends up suffering the same fate. He suffers the fate of hanging in the gallows. Well, the decree is set out. And notice Daniel. You've got to love Daniel at this point. I think, and I'll say it now, I think what you're going to see here is Daniel's been through this before. There have been other times when his faith has been challenged. He's made the decision to stay faithful to Yahweh. Again, we've mentioned that this has occurred for decades. This book is covering decades and decades of Daniel's life. And so now here's another challenge. Who knows how many other smaller skirmishes, smaller corporate battles, if you will, that he's faced along the way. Never mind all the people that have been in leadership over him. All the kings have always loved him, always supported him, always promoted him. He's remained faithful to the Lord, and that's been proven true over and over again. I think some of that contributes to this going on as well. Verses 10 through 13 then, the response. And this brings us to what we said earlier ago with scene 2, Daniel and his faithful praying only to God. It says now this: Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group, there we see that phrase again, and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree, reminding him, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And of course, yes, he says, yes, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So they're priming him. This is a lead-up question. There's going to be a follow-up question. We'll see that in a moment. We come back and look at the text a little bit more closely. Verse 13 then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, notice they don't call him one of the administrators or second in command. He's an exile from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty. Key in on that for a second. He does not pay any attention to you. We'll know what Daniel says later. Does not pay attention to you or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. We're going to stop there. We're going to pick up with the verse in a moment. But what we're going to see is when the decree goes out, Daniel goes about his business. Now, it almost seems as if he's doing this in defiance, but the text goes on to say he did what he always did. He prayed 3 times a day. Now, a couple of things on that. One about the 3 times a day, the other about praying to Jerusalem. There was nothing in the text in the Old Testament about praying 3 times a day. We do see traditions coming up later. In fact, in one of Jesus' parables, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Remember, the Pharisee talks about how he prays 3 times a day, and on and on. He fasts and so forth. So there would have been a tradition that developed, but there was no law saying you had to do that. Also, there was not a law saying that you would pray toward Jerusalem. Now, there is a text in 1 Kings chapter 8 when Solomon is praying in dedication of the temple, that in verses 46 to 51, there's a reference to when the people sin and they come to repent, they will face toward the temple in Jerusalem and pray. And so there is a sense in which that might happen. I've already maintained that Daniel is an innocent. He's an innocent bystander to the entire exile. But even in that text that it says when someone sins, the text goes on and says, and there's no one who hasn't sinned. Daniel, like Isaiah, maybe is identifying with his people throughout his lifetime, that he just finds it natural to pray toward Jerusalem. But he's doing this as he's always done before. This is what I call Daniel's act of civil disobedience. It's civil, obviously, because he's doing it just as he always did. He is violating a law, and therefore it is in disobedience. But what's going on here? It's not so much that Daniel has a problem with Darius, it's that he is loyal to Yahweh, and he is so honed in on and focused on obedience to Yahweh that it really doesn't matter. Like I said, he's been through all this before. Now, that doesn't mean that he is confident that God is going to rescue him from any traps that's going to come his way. Even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when faced with the fiery furnace, said, God can rescue us, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow to you. And I think that was probably Daniel's attitude through all this. He's still going to worship Yahweh. I mean, think about it. Throughout these last few decades, he's always stayed true to Yahweh, and yet he was always shown to be useful and loyal and promoted by his kings that led over him. So we just see Daniel going about his business. We want to think about that when we think about application later. Notice then what happens. The lead-in question is, didn't you make a decree? And the king says yes. And then there's the follow-up. Here's the kicker. Daniel, an exile from Judah, does not have any regard for your law. He pays no attention to you. He continues to pray 3 times a day. The reason I asked about why Darius doesn't think about the location of Daniel when all of these administrators and satraps come to him earlier about making the decree is right here. And that is because we do know that King Darius cared for and admired Daniel. Verse 14, this brings us to the next segment, the next scene. Darius puts Daniel in the lion's den, verses 14 to 23. When the king heard this, that's when the light went on. Oh my goodness. This decree, which I thought would just be some kind of generic thing. Rulers do this kind of thing all the time. We've seen it in the past with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, just this loyalty that they would seek from people. Now he knows there's a specific target in mind. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to try and save him. Now, notice there's a law in place, and no one is above the law. The king's not above the law. He made the decree. He needs to abide by it. And his abiding by it, he needs to enforce it. Daniel is supposed to abide by it. So he's really torn between the decree that he made, and I wonder how much he second-guessed that decree later, and his care for Daniel. So he's stalling. What can I do? What can I do? I need to get Daniel out of this. He waits throughout the rest of the day, and then in verse 15, the men come to him again. The men went, there's that phrase again, as a group, to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So what does Darius do? Verse 16. The king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. Notice the king isn't just hiding behind this. He's present. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. That's an important phrase there too. We've already seen that taking place, but what you have here with King Darius is he's acknowledging that to Daniel. You serve him continually. May your God save you. May your God rescue you. Well, what goes on in the next few verses? Let me just read on through the rest of this scene. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. He could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he's just near it, coming near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. Let me just stop at this point. That's the phrase that the others used with him. I think Daniel's a lot more sincere here, and I know it's probably just a general kind of greeting for the king, but I think Daniel demonstrates his sincerity here. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. Notice then the vindication on two levels. He's innocent before God, and he's also innocent of any crime against the king. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Let's go back and look at a couple of things in this text here then. We've already mentioned the fact that Darius tried to do anything he could to get out of this. He couldn't. It was his decree. He signed it, so he has to carry it out. His hope is that Daniel will be rescued. Now, to what extent Daniel or Darius has heard stories about Daniel in the past, being preserved from, destruction and punishment in the past. Who knows what he knows about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We do know that Daniel has demonstrated his service to Yahweh continually. And that is not lost on Darius. And so he just says, I just hope that your God will save you. You serve him continually. May he rescue you. And so while it's not a God that he serves, he definitely wants to see that this happens to Daniel. He does really, really care about Daniel. So what happens? We've already read. He didn't throw any parties, which would have been standard kind of fare. He doesn't, eat, have any entertainment. He just could not sleep. I can only imagine the anguish, and that's the word that's used, considering that's when he went, how he felt going to the tomb. He calls out, and I don't know what he's expecting. I guess, of course, if it's silent, then he knows that Daniel was killed. But Daniel there, I can imagine Darius's tone when he hears Daniel respond to him. Nothing's wrong. Notice that there was something supernatural going on, an angel. Think back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We're told there was someone like the Son of God there. Some of them might have said the phrase son of the gods. We know the implication that for the Jew and for us. Here, Daniel affirms the lions' mouths were shut by an angel. What Daniel interprets this to mean, of course, is this proves his innocence before God. It proves that he has never done anything wrong against the king. The king is relieved. He sees him and he inspects him just to make sure that there are no scratches on him. I find that kind of humorous if you think about it. I mean, if the lion's going to do damage, it's going to be more than just a scratch, right? But there's not even a scratch on him. But that leads us to scene 4, and what we titled scene 4 as, and it says here, of course, the reason he was able to come out unharmed is that he trusted in God. Well, scene 4, Darius's new decree about Daniel's God. Verses 24 to 28, we're going to see the turnabout with the administrators who plotted against Daniel. And then we're going to see Darius do something. We've seen something similar to this in the past with these other kings, but nothing like this. Verse 24 through the end. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of the earth, to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. Here is the note, here is the decree, if you will. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. And then you have this poetic statement describing the reasons. For he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. I'm going to stop there for a moment and we'll get to verse 28 in conclusion. Something happens here, just like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego coming out, those that went to get them out burned, kind of a justice there. And then what you have here is Darius putting the punishment on those who sought to conspire against Daniel. Now, again, depending on how many really showed up as representatives to conspire against Daniel, this could be a lot. What may trouble you is the fact that it says that not only were those who conspired against Daniel thrown in, but even their wives and children. And I think what you see taking place there is that there's an erasing of any of their legacy, that there be erasing of their memory from history because of that. There would be no lineage that they would carry out. And of course, we see that in some ways as an extreme thing. We do know in some forms of the ancient world, just like in Israel, people were identified by who they belonged to, and one and the many were together. And if one sinned, the group was punished. We see something like that with Achan in the book of Joshua, when he takes some of the booty, some of the treasures from the city of Jericho when they weren't supposed to, and not only Achan but others in his family and his servants were all destroyed. Notice then the decree. It goes out to everybody. He just sends a universal statement that everyone should fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Now, in past, Daniel was successful, and Nebuchadnezzar at one point said, no one should say anything bad about the king of Daniel, or the king, or the God of Daniel, or the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here, Darius goes even further. Worship, fear and reverence this God of Daniel. And he goes on and gives all the reasons. Of course, he speaks in generalities like performing signs and wonders, but then he speaks very specifically here about what he's done for Daniel. On a side note to this, it is interesting that even though he makes this decree, one of the things we have to be careful of, and we see this throughout history, is you can't even force this kind of reverence. Remember when Josiah, and during his time, they found the law in the law book in the temple. Josiah, with the right motive, decreed that they should worship only Yahweh. They should get back and reform their ways, and he sought to revival. But when you force it like that, it's not going to be successful. We don't see anything coming from this other than the decree. But personally, for Daniel, we see what happens last. Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so what we have here, let's talk about some things that we can think about as insights. Let me go back and share with you a little bit more on a screen some of these reflections and questions. Some application coming up. There's, again, a lot more that we can say regarding this, but let's focus on a couple of things here. One, a question for you. What challenges to your faith have you faced? We see Daniel, a lifetime of challenges. We'll speak to that in a second. But I know that you work, you have homes, you have families. And so you may have already faced many, many challenges to your faith, many attempts to cause you to compromise your faith. How well did you do there? I'm not going to go on all of my failures, but there have been times I've compromised. I think there are fewer in the last few years than there have been when I was younger. Second question, though, what potential compromises might you face personally? The thing that Daniel is faced with here, pretty big deal. Is he going to worship only Darius? Is he going to turn his back on God to do that? Is he going to do that simply to save his job, save his position? Um, what challenges, what compromises are you tempted with when faced with your job situation or a relationship? What potential compromises do you face? The fact of the matter is, though this is not a question, it's something to think about deeply. There are always going to be challenges. You're going to get past one. Some of them you're going to fail. Some of you you're going to succeed at. But there are always going to be challenges. The world is never ceasing in its assault with temptations to compromise. We may see in some countries full-blown persecution of Christians where it's illegal to be a Christian. We know in some forms of the Middle East, it's okay to be a Christian, but you can't convert anybody to Christianity. There are many, many places in the world where there are decrees basically in that term that it's not right. You cannot worship God. We know that there are places where they allow it, but they restrict it. We see that in China and so forth. The world is full of these challenges. The question is going to be, what are we going to do? And just bear this in mind. Since Christianity began, there has been persecution of Christians. It's not going to stop. There's not going to be an end until Jesus returns. There's not going to be an end to the time that we're going to face any kind of challenge. Sometimes it's subtle. Maybe it isn't a boss saying, no, I need you to do this. Give you one example for me. It wasn't about whether I was going to worship God or not, but it was a moral issue for me. I used to work at a rent-to-own store, and one of the things that my area manager had said, I'd worked there as a delivery driver and then eventually became the manager of the store. But as a manager of the store, he would ask me to do certain things. And one time he came up to me and he goes, they might be looking at this kind of TV or VCR or whatnot, but what we really want to do is get them to get into this bigger TV, this more expensive TV. And I just said, okay, and went about my business. But I knew in my heart I was never going to do that. If a person came in and saw something that they were looking for, I would guide them in that. If they decided after they'd seen something else that they were interested in that, then I would just help them find what they were looking for. I was never going to do the bait and switch. I was going to be an honest salesperson. You may face challenges like that as well. There are going to be any kind of challenges in business, and there may be challenges in a church setting as well. The last few then. Daniel shows us that success in the world is not wrong, but it doesn't and it can't replace our commitment to God. Status isn't everything. Think about this. When Daniel faces this challenge, he knows he's been successful, he's been promoted, he's been loyal to his superiors, but it was never going to come at a cost of losing his faith. He knew right when he was told that it was going to be wrong to pray to anybody but Darius, he went straight to God and prayed. Who knows all that he prayed? It says he prayed for help. It says he continued to give thanks to God. It wasn't a second thought. He had been through enough of these challenges that he just went about his business. He knew that he was successful. He was, by the world standards, being rewarded with all of his hard work, but it never got in the way of his commitment to God. Related to that, then we need to remain uncompromising in our faithfulness to God. We need to always know what our true loyalty is. Again, notice there was not any question in Daniel. There was not, well, what's going to happen if I do this? What if I don't? He just went straight to God. And I hope that when you are faced with a challenge, that's your attitude. I hope when I'm faced with those challenges, that's my attitude. We know there's something wrong if we start to think, well, is there a way that I can do this and still be this? Daniel made the point. He went straight to God. He knew where his loyalties lay. Each challenge to your faith that you meet strengthens you. Now, you learn from those challenges that you fail, but you also learn that when you meet a challenge, you get stronger. This was Daniel's case. This was not his first go around. We've pointed that out. He was continually faithful and continually loyal to Yahweh. When he was confronted with this situation, he knew where to go. And I know that there are many of you living a lifetime of faith that whenever you've been challenged, you knew to go straight to God. It was never a question that you were going to worship God and God alone. You were not going to go and sacrifice your compromise your convictions. And then lastly, think about this. You are leaving a legacy of faithfulness as you are remaining faithful. The one thing I've maintained throughout our discussion in the book of Daniel is that it's a book that was preserved for those who came back from exile and for centuries afterwards as a reminder that they can be faithful and that this is what God expects, and there is the reward for that faithfulness. And so this was a book of encouragement. If Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can do it, they can do it. There's a legacy of faith. We can do it. We need to be thinking about the fact that as we are faithful, there will be that legacy that we can pass on to others. Remember what happened to those who conspired against Daniel. They and their entire families were gone. There was no legacy. There was no memory. Well, as we conclude, I just want to continue to encourage you, knowing that as we walk day by day, we face challenging times. There are questions that we continue to ask, but in reality, we know that we can keep our eyes focused on God and God alone. What I'd like to do is have a word of prayer. And as we do that, I pray that you will continue as we move forward into the worship service shortly, that you will prepare your hearts for worship. Let's pray. Father, we are thankful for this day. I just pray right now that as we have read about the life of Daniel and looking back on the other narratives in this text, we've seen Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We've seen how they've been able to be loyal to you without compromise. And I just pray, Father, that you would give us the strength to do that. We know we're going to face challenges. There are many challenges that we face today that would maybe lead us to think about doing something immoral or illegal just to survive. I pray, Father, that as we are faced with challenges and decisions that we make about job or a relationship or just what decisions we're going to make about living day by day, that we would know that we focus on you and we trust in you. We know that just as Daniel was serving you continually, we can serve you continually. And I just pray that we would show our trust in you. We love you and praise you. And we give this time to you. Continue to be worshiped in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Very good. We'll see you again soon.